There is a life's work in the portfolio of garden designer Arabella Lennox Boyd. 6 gold medals at Chelsea, 50 years of creating gardens for everyone from the Duke of Westminster to Sting and Trudy Styler. 50 years in which every new garden has been, and continues to be, a discovery.
It's a whole new world of adventure and of fun, because I think the gardening should be fun. Even designing a tiny garden, I want to have fun.
Trained in London, Arabella Lennox Boyd came to see the importance of observation. Her life has taken her to gardens in Europe, Japan, China, and the Islamic world. Those influenced her work, public and private. But a little part of her will forever be where she was born and grew up, Italy.
What I liked was the wilderness around us and the natural landscape. That was my connection. It was really with the wildflowers and nature. One has to be in contact with nature. I think nature teaches you so much.
Arabella Lennox Boyd's life has been one of contrasts. A childhood at the family house in Italy, a move in her 20s to London, where she started a small garden design company, and then marriage to the Conservative MP Sir Mark Lennox Boyd, who was variously Parliamentary Private Secretary to Margaret Thatcher and Under Secretary of State at the Foreign Office.
I love this Hosta. I wish I remembered the name.
Which is how she found herself in Lancashire, where Sir Mark was Member of Parliament for Morecambe and Lonsdale, with a new home, Gresgarth Hall. After Italy, was it a shock? It could have been.
No, I tell you, I'm never shocked. I was philosophical. I've always wanted to have a country house, and my husband, it's his career. He said, I'm really worried about the climate being so different for you. And my reaction was, look, I've moved from Italy to England. Whether it's a bit colder or wetter, it doesn't make any difference to me. It was a bit frightening, I must say, because I don't understand Gothic, really, even though I do love it now. But I mean, it's not part of my being, you know. I'm used to Rome. So Gothic was like a bad word in my childhood. And also at the bottom of a valley as opposed to being on top of a hill. The hills that surround the house are like a corset in a way, and because it was so wild when we bought it, because it had been slightly abandoned, the owners had let it for years, so the whole place was very depressing and full of evergreens. And again, you know, I was brought up with olives and silver olives and the wonderful oaks. And, I didn't even have Quercus ilex, the home oak around me. So evergreens were not my favorite. But of course they planted them because it stopped the wind from being so fierce. But I had to get rid of every single conifer I could lay my hands on, and everything went, and I opened up the views. But I found that was difficult at the beginning. And of course the climate is pretty harsh. People come here like on a day like today, and it's heaven. There's very little water in the river, and it's beautifully calm, and you have these lovely blue skies and the scent and the breeze. Well, it's not like that in the winter. So it took me a few years to get used to it, but I love it now, obviously, I do.
Craigscarth would, in time, speak to Arabella Lennox Boyd's skill as a designer. It's emerged over 40 years and continues to evolve. Here she is, of course, designer and client. And the plan of this garden was made not before, but after she laid it out, the exact reverse of the procedure she now uses with her other clients.
When we bought the house, the garden, there was hardly any garden at all, and first thing I did was to enlarge the garden. And actually, this was when I was thinking of the design of the garden. But when we actually arrived, I planted the first 6 magnolias on this bank on the other side of the river, very, very steep, and very little soil over rocky ground. But I redesigned the entrance and then the terraces round the house and the lake and everything else. But it wasn't all designed at once. I designed it over the years, and it kind of developed. And as it happens, it all makes sense at the moment. But it wasn't a conscious design. So I have the lake with the spring borders on one side, on the river side, which lead into the wild garden, and then into a very empty space with no plants at all, even though it does show a few trees. I've taken some out. And then the borders, which are facing west, and the purpose of all the hedges on that side of the garden is to stop the wind destroying the garden near the house, because we get these very strong winds. There is an area called the Lilac Walk, which was planted with a multitude of lilacs, which actually don't like it there very much. So I've planted other things, and leading on to the orchard. And next to it is the vegetable garden, which was there. The walls were there, but I redesigned the beds. Beyond that is the rhododendron wood, where I have my collection of rhododendrons and magnolias and other trees. And that leads into the wilder parts of the wood, which go up the valley for about a mile.
In committing what she'd done at Craigscarth to paper, a kind of ex post facto plan, Arabella Lennox Boyd was codifying her design principles. Some of those had been created as she went along, but some had been there from the time in her life when she'd embarked on a career in garden design. In London in the 1960s, the young Arabella Parisi signed up for a course on landscape architecture at Thames Polytechnic. She had to squeeze it in around the day job she'd taken after arriving from Italy. But if the course was long, it was also life-changing, partly because one of her tutors was Robert Cardozo. In London, he taught his students how to use the senses to assess a garden when walking around it, and, crucially, he stressed the power of observation.
He was very influential in that I'd never thought of the fact that when you're drawing a garden on a plan, you instinctively sort of want to design spaces. And he said, no, you can't design a space, you can carve a space. So he said, imagine that your paper is black and you're carving the garden out of this black forest. You will then make a proper space. And he's so right, because usually spaces can be ineffectual because they're not solid enough, they're not powerful enough. And so I feel that whatever space you design, whether it's a path or a wide road or a circle or an oval, you need to give it strength and real meaning.
The course at Thames Polytechnic served Arabella well. She would later be awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Greenwich, as it became. Her life, full of awards, would also see her made a trustee of Kew, the Chelsea Physic Garden, the Yorkshire Arboretum, and English Heritage. The design business took off. Now there are over 800 gardens around the world to her designs, from Sting's spectacular villa in Tuscany to a baronial house in Scotland, to this Greek revival house in Pennsylvania. At Eaton Hall in Cheshire, home of the Duke and Duchess of Westminster, Arabella had to, in her own words, think big, to design a setting on a scale which would fit the enormity of the house. That was over 30 years ago, and the first thing she did was to produce a master plan for the 89 acres, covering not only how the 15 main gardens would look, but also how the whole area would be managed, down to the number of times a year the lawns would be mown. And that was before she turned her attention to the vegetable garden, the tea house garden, the hot borders, and the inner and outer parks, to restore the historic views, some of which had been lost since the plans of the early 1700s, through to the building of the huge palace designed by Alfred Waterhouse in the 1870s. This is the art of the designer at another level, and the result is spectacular. Arabella still goes back regularly. Eaton Hall's progress has mirrored her own career. There is no doubt that she relishes a challenge. In the Isle of Wight, there was an opportunity to work in a different climate with new and different plant palettes, but also something that hadn't bothered her at Eaton Hall: a garden on a cliff, exposed and windblown. She remodelled the approach to the house and laid out terraces with formal touches. Here, in the pool garden, a double line of yew cubes leading the eye across the lawn to the view of the sea. The main herbaceous borders are made up of 6 square beds, but they give the impression of being 2 continuous borders. Those taxus hedges at the back are staggered so that you can walk between them into the woodland beyond. Everywhere there is the mixture of formal and informal, between the architectural aspects of garden design and relaxed areas of wildflower planting, for instance, a combination all designers strive to get just right. With success came opportunities to travel, to see gardens in the Islamic world, in China and in Japan, where a tour in 2008 made her think.
They are so sophisticated in their thinking and their sort of single-mindedness about what they are actually trying to describe or design or plant, that it's where the light catching a stone is very important. The shape of a tree is vital. The condition of the grass or the moss is also vital. And so it made me think that maybe we're rather clumsy. I mean, I felt very clumsy coming back and seeing, that really what I do is that I just, I plant things where I think they look nice, but I don't really stop and think, well, how will that look in the evening, or how will it look in the winter? And so that, taught me a little bit of that. But of course, I'm not Japanese, and I'm European, and I'm Italian, and so my character is what it is. But it did make me want to, for example, prune trees in a proper way and see shapes in the winter and respect the light of a place and the view and the feeling of the countryside. So I maybe just went a little bit beyond what I was before.
Back home, Arabella Lennox Boyd had developed a style.
When I go on site, the first thing I go round it, trying to understand what's growing there and the existing design and why it was done. And then, of course, I start thinking of why I don't like it, why it has to change. And I also assume it has to change, otherwise people wouldn't call me in. And usually I'm not called in to do little borders. I've never done that. I've been so lucky. I've always changed everything. And I'm quite hands-on and quite interfering. I want to change, if I could, I would change the gutters, I mean, I like to have a hand at everything, but I accept also that in many cases, I'm not allowed to do that. I make sure that I get a first impression, which is, I've always found it is the one that I have to be careful to keep, because it's very much a gut feeling, which I think I don't ever want to lose, because sometimes you get drawn into difficulties and the client's wishes, or something happens and you get, or the designer you're working with also, I obviously have people who I work with who slightly kind of push you on a way that you don't feel you should be. And I always try and go back to my initial instinct, which is usually in general right, in a very general way I'm not talking about detail.
Then Arabella Lennox Boyd draws, something she's always done.
That movement of your arm and your hand is just vital for a path. You can't draw a path unless it's straight. With a computer, it just doesn't work. I can just see those drawings that sometimes are presented to me, when I do a path, and then it goes to my wonderful colleague who then puts it on computer. And of course, then he does that, and then he does that, and I say, no. It can't be, because that first curve is just slightly not a curve. And the other one is smaller than you've done, sort of. Anyway, I'm a bit fussy like that, but I enjoy. That's what I enjoy. I love putting pen to paper or pencil to paper. I like to have the physical feeling of actually, I'm designing on paper, but I'm in the garden somehow. I feel that I'm through those trees and out into the open, or that I'm designing a sort of little parterre or whatever.
There are often personal connections with these garden designs. In Dundee, Arabella Lennox Boyd was asked to design a garden for Maggie's Centre, a respite house for cancer sufferers, one of many such centres established around the country, in memory of Maggie Jenks, who Arabella knew. In fact, she'd given Maggie and her husband Charles advice on garden design, and they became friends. The Maggie's Centre building in Dundee was designed by the Canadian-American architect Frank Gehry, but the area around it was left untouched.
When I went there, I was bowled over by the the beauty of the building, of the Frank Gehry building, but also I was horrified by the way it was separated from the main hospital, which was, not very beautiful architecture and very big and overpowering. And I tried to put myself in the shoes of somebody who's been told that he's got cancer in that hospital, and then wanting to find a way to the beautiful, beautiful, inviting building down at the bottom. It was slightly below the hospital. There was no connection. There was just a sort of amorphous field and some trees. So the first idea of connecting the two was to create this space with the labyrinth, where I thought it's a design I love and I often use.
There is here evidence of what Arabella calls her spiritual side, an understanding that a garden can and should be designed to provide peace and calm. Reflection has been important to her, and that informed her work in Dundee, a tribute to her friend. This social aspect of her work appeals to Arabella. For Airfield, just outside Dublin, she helped frame an unusual kitchen garden that's open to the public, a community project with a difference. For this design, her thoughts turned to the vegetable gardens of her childhood in Italy and to Villandry, the great chateau garden in the Loire.
The main thing I really loved about that was that the fact that it's so near Dublin, and that people and children and grown-ups could go and actually understand what a vegetable garden is all about. And of course, because it's open to the public, we had to make it look pretty. So there is quite a lot of beds which are planted with ornamental things, and also vegetables are very ornamental if you plant them all together.
In London, there was a commission to create a garden at the new Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park, designed by the British-Iraqi architect Zaha Hadid, a garden with which, like many of her projects, she's still involved.
I like going back because you get these sort of wonderful impressions and experiences. But I do go back, yes. I do go back, and I did, and I was very impressed by what it looked like. We have a very good gardener who looks after it, and very important for a herbaceous border, because herbaceous borders are very indisciplined. They do what they want. So you have to keep an eye on them and kind of stop them doing what they want sometimes.
Returning frequently to the gardens she's created to check that everything is just so is a thread through the story of Arabella Lennox Boyd's design career. She keeps an office in London, though you get the feeling that most of the details are in her head, an encyclopedic knowledge not only of plants, but also of the design of the scores of gardens she's made over 5 decades. But there is one particular garden to which she's drawn more than any other, the Palazzo in Italy, where she was born, which stayed in her family and which is now in her care. Arabella Lennox Boyd has vivid memories of her childhood in the Palazzo Parisi, 90 minutes drive north of Rome. Not that there were cars when she was young. Getting to and from Rome involved a donkey and a cart for part of the journey. This was post-war Italy, and although the house was grand, The Parisi family lived in only 3 of its 40 rooms. But in some senses, it was idyllic.
First of all, I was free. You know, I could go and where I wanted. My mother would literally sort of open the front door and out I would go, and I would have all my friends in the village and we'd go for walks. We did everything on foot, of course, or on a donkey. But we only used donkeys really for sort of, if I ever had to go back to Rome. So we'd have to get on the donkey, down a hill, up another hill, and down another hill, and then eventually we would reach the road, having had a wonderful lunch on the way. So it was rather a wonderful adventure.
It was here on a hilltop between Rome and the Apennines that Arabella's love of nature was nurtured, that she came to love the rhythm of the seasons, the wild flowers, the freedom of the empty countryside, the genius loci, the sense of place, and the views.
You had these views on one side of the Apennines and on the other of the very nearly the Roman Campagna Romana. I mean, not quite, but you could just see that there was a big plain beyond the hills, the rolling hills. One has to be in contact with nature. I think nature teaches you so much. First of all, it teaches you patience, which people are very impatient. I'm very impatient too. But on the other hand, I do know to wait, because you have to wait. You know, you have to. You're looking at a plant now, and you say, I'm going to prune it, and then you have to wait for the year after to see the result. So everything, there's always a waiting time. You have to be quiet, and you have to let nature take its course.
Though she moved to England, Arabella spent all her holidays in Italy. Her children came to love this place as she did. And looking back, she admits that her early observations, including those made on trips to Rome, informed her later career as a garden designer.
I had a wonderful girl that looked after me when I was about 6 or 7, who actually took me round Rome and showed me all the sights, and that was very influential. And obviously, we did look at things. We didn't look at people. You're not supposed to look at people. It's quite rude to stare at somebody, but you can stare at a building or a view or the Tiber, with all the wonderful buildings surrounding it. The center of Rome has remained the same as it was ever. I mean, we have a big print of Rome which is dated 17-something, 1780 or 1760, I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly, but it's exactly like that. I mean, nothing has changed. So you are surrounded by amazing buildings, wonderful squares, proper spaces, views into lovely courtyards, vistas, and of course the wonderful sculpture. And so, I can't say that it was a conscious thing, but it definitely has is in me. I just know it is, because if you look, and I was taught to look very early on in life, if you look, you take so much in that you don't even, it's sort of subconscious.
It was not only the classical antiquity of Rome that impressed Arabella Lennox Boyd. She fell in love with Ninfa, the estate south of the capital, its Roman remains rescued from dereliction in the 1920s by the Caetani family.
I'll never forget the first time I went to Ninfa, which was with a girlfriend, with an introduction to the owners who were still alive. We just arrived unannounced in a very Italian way. You know, we just assumed that we would be allowed to go in. And they were having lunch, which was very embarrassing. But anyway, they were incredibly kind, and they opened the door and they said, yes, come in. And it was like walking into paradise. It was quite a revelation, because I realized that actually you could, I knew you could tame nature, but I didn't know that you could marry it, that you could actually sort of you could imitate it. It didn't occur to me. You didn't expect to suddenly be confronted with water, the sound of water, the scent of flowers, and these amazing ruins of the Byzantine city which was there, covered in roses, and roses tumbling in the water. I mean, it was just magic. The little small Roman bridge crossing it, and then the trout, huge, enormous trout, which are endemic to that river. It was absolutely magical.
The gardens at Ninfa now have the status of a natural monument visited by over 70,000 people a year. They are at one end of an arc which describes Arabella's connections to Italy: Ninfa, Rome, and the Palazzo Parizzi, where she is surrounded by memories of her mother and father, where she redesigns the garden from time to time, and where perhaps she has time to reflect on the gardens she's designed all over the world. At Gresgarth Hall in Lancashire, the English home of the designer Arabella Lennox Boyd, Lady Lennox Boyd we should call her because of her marriage to Sir Mark Lennox Boyd, though she doesn't use her title in her work, it's early July. Arabella is just back from London and has 2 or 3 days before leaving for Italy to check on her ancestral home. It's an opportunity to talk to the Gresgarth gardeners, to find out how plants are doing, what needs tweaking.
This is where I'm trialling out plants put together in a more casual way and mixed with various grasses here which do well in this part of the world. I.e. in this very wet weather. And it's rather wonderful to see it growing so well and looking so healthy and full of flower.
And to consider how very different it all is from the day she stood here and thought about what it should look like. Robert Cardozo's advice about carving out came to mind.
I redesigned everything. I redesigned the whole lot. It was very depressing. There was no garden, and the whole garden sloped down towards the river, so the house was sort of perched on a slope, but in a sort of very unnatural way. So the very first thing I did was to carve out all the terraces. I mean, there was a little terrace, but it was very narrow and no flowers and nothing. And I suppose in my mind the bad weather and the depression of being down the hill was exaggerated, but I felt I need the house to rise out of a garden. So that's what I designed. I enlarged the terraces, I built some steps, and I carved out the garden, which is flat round the house, and that is my little formal Italian sort of imprint, because then as you move away, you simply have to go into what nature's given me.
What nature gave the Lennox Boyds was trees, hundreds of them, by now so dense that they couldn't see the river. There were three aims early on: to remove evergreens, to vary tree types, and to plant magnolias.
A very, very eminent plantsman came here. It was somebody called Peter Smithers, who was also a friend because of politics and all that. And he was a great plantsman and had a wonderful magnolia collection in Switzerland, which I'd seen. And I said, Peter, just please give me a few names of more magnolias. I planted 4 or 5, but I'd like to have many more. And also maybe give me some ideas of what trees I should plant. And he said, magnolias? No, never. They'll never do here. Just concentrate on alder and birch and willow. To which I said, my dear, no. And off I went, and I started my collection of magnolias, of which I have about 300 or 400 now.
That rebellion paid off, and later, as a trustee of Kew Gardens, Arabella Lennox Boyd's knowledge of trees was expanded to the point where she could make wise choices about tree planting at Gresgarth.
I was told by my great friend John Simmons, who was the curator at Kew, that I should concentrate on plants that come from China as opposed from South America, because China, Sichuan in particular, or Yunnan, has got the same climate as we have here. And so I started concentrating on that and learning about that. And of course, then I started traveling, which meant that I saw these plants in the wild. And so it's become a great passion, and throughout this adventure, really, in learning about trees and where they come from and their importance and their beauty and whatever, I then started collecting. It's a whole new world of adventure and of fun, because I think that gardening should be fun. I really, even designing a tiny garden, I want to have fun.
Trees are one thing, but Arabella Lennox Boyd says she's most content in one of her greenhouses, just potting seeds and cuttings. It's a reminder that she's a plants woman, and that designing has been a way of putting her knowledge of plants to practical use. 50 years ago, one led to the other. If there's been a constant in her career, it's the fight against nature. At first, she thought it could be tamed. Now she concedes it can't. And Gresgarth is a good example of that.
You can't fight it. You can't fight it even in a tiny London garden. I was thinking of that the other day in my garden. Suddenly, everything is too big. The climber on the wall collapsed because it hadn't been pruned. And so plants have got this life which carries on regardless. Of course, here we have a very, very strong. The whole place is immensely strong. And you're constantly fighting against it. You're keeping all the weeds away. You have the river that breaks its banks because it's rained too much. There's nothing you can do about that. The weather is unpredictable. That's the other thing that you have in England. The weather is unpredictable. You can never say exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. You have to accept that you can't control the growth of plants, you can't control anything in nature.
Arabella Lennox Boyd shows no signs of slowing down. The garden, that's the garden at Gresgarth, the garden at Palazzo Parisi, the gardens she's designed for others, and the garden in the abstract, has been and remains her life.
The one thing I have learned is that you have to detach. You have to detach from your gardens, because once you've done them, they're like children. You have to let them grow and you have to let them go. Very difficult.
Next time, Tom Stuart-Smith has designed some of the most spectacular gardens in the country. Many imagined first on paper, most integrated to the landscape, and all aimed at bringing out the spirit of the place.
There are a number of holy grails, and one of them is about emplacement, making a place feel like a natural coming together of its context.
Grand gardens are one thing, but in Wakefield, Tom Stuart-Smith has been dealing with a different challenge: how to create a garden for a new art gallery dedicated to the work of sculptor Dame Barbara Hepworth, and to do it on wasteland hemmed in by a vast Victorian building and a 6-lane highway.
I was thinking in civic terms rather than garden terms, actually, about the importance of creating almost a sort of semi-defensible space. When you came into it, there would be an exhalation. You would leave the city behind, leave the traffic behind, and you would be in this cultivated, cultured, looked after space.